What are you doing? The voice cut through the silence like a knife, sharp and trembling with a mix of shock and something else, something hotter, more electric. Ethan froze, his hands still wrapped around himself, the TV screen casting a faint blue glow over the dim room. He turned his head slowly, cheeks burning, to see Mrs. Harper standing in the doorway. Her eyes were wide, her lips slightly parted, and her chest rising and falling as if she'd just run up the stairs. She was wearing that silky robe she always did at night, the one that clung to her curves in ways he'd tried so hard not to notice. Ethan stammered, scrambling to pull the blanket over his lap, but it was too late. She'd seen everything. His heart pounded so loudly he was sure she could hear it from across the room. The air felt heavy, charged with something he couldn't quite name, shame, yes, but also heat. A stifling, undeniable heat that made his skin prickle. Mrs. Harper stepped further into the room, closing the door behind her with a soft click. The sound sent a jolt through him. "Do you do this often?" she asked, her voice softer now, almost curious. She tilted her head, her dark hair falling over one shoulder, and for a moment, Ethan forgot how to breathe. It had started innocently enough. Ethan had been over at Jake's house after school, as usual. They'd been friends since middle school, and Jake's place had always felt like a second home to him. But lately, things had shifted. Maybe it was because they were seniors now, on the cusp of adulthood, or maybe it was because Mrs. Harper had started wearing those low-cut blouses that made it impossible not to notice how stunning she was. Whatever it was, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about her. Tonight, Jake had gone to bed early, complaining about a headache. Ethan had stayed downstairs, flipping through channels aimlessly, when he stumbled upon that show. It wasn't anything special, just some late-night cable drama, but there was a scene, a particular scene, that caught his attention. The way the woman on screen moved, the look in her eyes, it reminded him of someone. Someone who lived in this very house. Before he knew it, his hand had wandered south, and he'd lost himself in the fantasy. He hadn't meant to get caught. He hadn't even considered the possibility. But now, as Mrs. Harper stood before him, her gaze lingering on the blanket draped over his lap, he realized he wasn't entirely sorry. "You know," she said slowly, stepping closer, "you shouldn't be watching stuff like that." Her tone was scolding, but there was a flicker of amusement in her eyes, a spark that made Ethan's stomach twist. She stopped just inches away, close enough that he could smell her perfume, something floral and warm that made his head spin. I didn't mean to," he mumbled, his throat dry. "It just came on, and I." She raised an eyebrow, a small smile playing on her lips. "And you what?" Ethan swallowed hard, his mind racing. He wanted to look away, to hide, but her presence was magnetic. He couldn't tear his eyes from hers. I got carried away," he admitted quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. She just stood there, studying him, her expression unreadable. Then, without warning, she reached out and brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. Her fingers lingered there for a heartbeat longer than necessary, and Ethan felt his breath hitch. "You're a bad influence," she murmured, though the way she said it didn't sound like a reprimand. It sounded like a challenge. Ethan's pulse quickened. "Me?" he managed to choke out. "How am I the bad influence?" She laughed softly, and the sound sent shivers down his spine. "Oh, don't play innocent. You know exactly what you're doing." Her hand trailed down to rest on his shoulder, her touch light but deliberate. "You've been driving me crazy for weeks." Ethan blinked, stunned. I have." She nodded, her smile widening. "Yes, you have. And honestly, I'm tired of pretending I don't notice the way you look at me." Her voice dropped to a whisper, low and husky. "Or the way you feel about me." Ethan's heart was pounding so hard now he thought it might burst. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. What could he possibly say to that? How could he explain the way she consumed his thoughts, the dreams he'd had that left him drenched in sweat and aching with need? As if reading his mind, Mrs. Harper leaned in closer, her breath warm against his ear. "Tell me," she whispered, her lips brushing his skin in a way that made him shudder. "Do you think about me when you touch yourself?" The question hit him like a punch to the gut, raw and unfiltered. He should have denied it. He should have looked away, apologized, and left the room. But instead, he found himself nodding, his voice barely audible as he confessed, all the time. She let out a soft sigh, her hand sliding down to cup his cheek. "Good," she murmured, her thumb tracing his bottom lip. "Because I've been thinking about you too." And then, before he could process what was happening, her lips were on his, soft and demanding all at once. Ethan froze for a split second, his brain short-circuiting, before instinct took over. He kissed her back desperately, his hands reaching up to tangle in her hair as she deepened the kiss. She tasted like wine and mint, sweet and intoxicating, and Ethan was drowning in her. Every nerve in his body was on fire, every touch sending shocks of electricity through him. Her hands roamed over his chest, slipping beneath his shirt to trace the lines of his muscles, and he groaned into her mouth, the sound low and guttural. When she finally pulled away, both of them were breathing heavily, their faces flushed. Her eyes were dark with desire, her lips swollen from their kisses. "Come upstairs," she said, her voice thick with need. "Before we wake the whole house." Ethan hesitated for the briefest of moments, his conscience whispering warnings he was too far gone to heed. Then he nodded, letting her take his hand and lead him toward the stairs. The hallways were shadowy, the only sound the soft creak of floorboards beneath their feet. Each step felt surreal, like a dream he never wanted to wake from. When they reached her bedroom, she turned to him, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his knees weak. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "We can stop now if you want." But Ethan didn't want to stop. He wanted her. More than anything he'd ever wanted in his life. So he closed the distance between them, pressing his lips to hers again as his hands fumbled with the tie of her robe. When it fell open, revealing the lace beneath, he nearly lost his mind. "I'm sure," he murmured against her skin, his voice rough with longing. "God, I'm so sure." And then, the air between them was electric, thick with the unspoken words that had simmered beneath the surface for far too long. Mrs. Harper's robe pulled at her feet, revealing the delicate lace of her nightgown that clung to her curves like a second skin. Ethan's breath hitched as his eyes traced the lines of her body, his pulse quickening with every inch he took in. She was everything, every fantasy he had ever conjured in his mind, and more. His hands trembled as they hovered over her shoulders, unsure where to land, but she didn't hesitate. Her fingers threaded through his hair, tugging him closer until their lips met again in a kiss that was anything but gentle. It was hungry, desperate, as if they were both trying to make up for all the moments they had denied themselves this connection. Ethan's tongue slid against hers, and the soft moan that escaped her throat sent a jolt of heat straight to his core. "Ethan," she murmured against his mouth, her voice low and trembling with something he couldn't quite name. We really shouldn't." But her words trailed off as his hand slid down her side, fingertips brushing over the curve of her hip. The contact made her shiver, and she leaned into him, her body betraying the hesitation in her voice. Ethan could feel the heat radiating from her, the way her heart raced under his palm as it rested just above the swell of her melons. He wanted to savor every second of this, to memorize the way she felt against him, but the urgency coursing through him was impossible to ignore. "I know," he whispered, his voice rough with need. "But I don't care." Her answering sigh was almost a surrender, and when she pressed her hips against his, he could feel how much she wanted this too. The thin fabric of his jeans did little to hide the hardness straining against the zipper, and the way her gaze flickered down before meeting his again was enough to make his head spin. She reached for his shirt, her fingers fumbling with the buttons as if she couldn't wait to feel his skin against hers. "Let me," he said softly, catching her hands in his. He guided them away, then slowly began to undo the buttons himself, watching her face as he revealed more of himself to her. Her lips parted slightly, her breath coming faster as his chest came into view, and when he finally let the shirt fall to the floor, she reached out to touch him. Her fingers were cool against his heated skin, tracing the lines of muscle with a reverence that made his stomach tighten. "You're so beautiful," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. The words sent a flush of warmth through him, and he leaned into her touch, craving more. But she wasn't content to just look. Her hand slipped lower, brushing over the waistband of his jeans before pausing. Her eyes met his, searching for any sign of hesitation, but all she found was raw, unfiltered desire. She unhooked the button, then slowly pulled down the zipper, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet room. Ethan held his breath as she pushed the fabric down, freeing him from the confines of his clothes. Her gaze dropped, and the way her lips parted told him everything he needed to know. She wanted him just as much as he wanted her. He stepped closer, his hands finding her waist as he guided her backward toward the bed. The backs of her knees hit the edge, and she sank down onto the mattress, her eyes never leaving his. There was something almost hypnotic about the way she looked at him, like she was seeing him for the first time, like he was all that mattered in that moment. "Are you scared?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. He knelt on the bed, hovering over her, close enough to feel the warmth of her body but not quite touching. She shook her head, her dark hair fanning out around her like a halo. "Not with you," she replied, her voice steady despite the rapid rise and fall of her chest. "Never with you." Her words sent a surge of emotion through him, and he couldn't hold back anymore. He kissed her again, deeper this time, his hands roaming over her body as if he couldn't get enough of her. When his fingers brushed over the hem of her nightgown, she arched into his touch, a silent plea for more. He didn't need to be told twice. Slowly, he lifted the fabric, revealing inch after inch of smooth, pale skin. His breath caught as the last of it slipped over her head, leaving her bare before him. She was perfection, every line and curve of her body etched into his memory forever. He couldn't tear his eyes away, couldn't stop himself from reaching out to touch her, to feel the warmth of her skin beneath his palms. "Ethan," she breathed, her voice trembling as his hand cupped her melons, his thumb brushing over the hardened peak. The sound of his name on her lips was almost enough to push him over the edge, but he forced himself to go slow, to savor every moment of this. He lowered his head, capturing her hardened peak in his mouth, and the moan she let out was music to his ears. Her hands gripped his shoulders, nails digging into his skin as her hips rocked against his. The friction was maddening, but he wasn't ready yet, not when there was still so much of her left to explore. He trailed kisses down her stomach, pausing just above the apex of her thighs. She tensed slightly, her breath hitching as she realized his intentions. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please." That single word was all the encouragement he needed. He pressed a kiss to the inside of her thigh, then another, each one pulling her further into the storm building between them. When he finally tasted her, she cried out, her back arching off the bed as pleasure ripped through her. He kept going, his tongue working in slow, deliberate strokes until she was trembling beneath him, her fingers tangled in his hair. It wasn't long before her breathing became ragged, her hips bucking against his mouth as she teetered on the edge. And when she finally fell, he was right there with her, holding her close as waves of ecstasy crashed over her. Her cries echoed in the room, filling the space with a raw, primal energy that left them both breathless. As the aftershocks subsided, she pulled him up to her, her lips crashing against his in a kiss that was equal parts passion and gratitude. Her hands roamed over his back, pulling him closer until there was no space left between them. "Don't stop," she murmured against his lips, her voice pleading. "I need you." Ethan's heart pounded as he pulled back slightly, his breath mingling with hers in the warm, intimate space between them. Her hands gripped his shoulders, her nails pressing into his skin just enough to send a shiver down his spine. He could feel the heat radiating from her body, a magnetic pull that drew him closer, deeper into the whirlpool of their shared desire. "I want you," she whispered, her voice trembling with need. Her eyes locked onto his, dark and unyielding, and for a moment, it felt like the rest of the world had faded away, leaving only the two of them tangled in this forbidden dance. He hesitated, his mind racing even as his body screamed for more. This wasn't just about the physical connection anymore, it was something else entirely. Something raw, something real. And yet, a part of him still wondered if he was dreaming. How could someone like her, so beautiful, so confident, so out of reach, want someone like him? But then her fingers brushed against his cheek, her touch grounding him, pulling him back to the present. "You don't have to be afraid," she said softly, her thumb tracing the curve of his jaw. "This is where we both belong." Her words shattered the last remnants of doubt clinging to him. With a slow exhale, he leaned in, capturing her lips in a kiss that was tender yet urgent, soft but hungry. She responded eagerly, her hands sliding down to his chest, feeling the rapid thud of his heartbeat beneath her palms. It was as if she wanted to memorize every inch of him, to etch this moment into her memory forever. His hands began to explore her body with a newfound confidence, trailing over the smooth planes of her stomach, the gentle dip of her waist, the soft swell of her hips. Every touch elicited a quiet gasp or a low hum of approval from her, spurring him on. When his fingers brushed against the sensitive skin of her inner thigh, she let out a sharp intake of breath, her legs parting instinctively. "God, Ethan," she murmured, her voice breaking as his hand moved higher, teasing her with feather-light touches that made her squirm beneath him. He could feel how wet she was already, her arousal coating his fingers as he traced small circles around her most sensitive spot. Her hips lifted off the bed, chasing his touch, silently begging for more. He obliged, slipping a finger inside her, watching her face contort with pleasure as he slowly worked her body. Her head fell back against the pillows, her lips parted in a silent cry as waves of sensation rippled through her. He added another finger, curling them just right, and she gasped, her hands clutching at the sheets. "Yes, yes." Her moans grew louder, more desperate, until they filled the room, echoing in his ears and drowning out any lingering reservations he might have had. He bent his head to her chest, his lips brushing over one hardened peak before taking it into his mouth, sucking gently as his fingers continued their relentless rhythm. She arched into him, her body trembling as she teetered on the edge of release once again. "Please," she begged, her voice hoarse with need. "I can't, oh God, I can't hold on." He didn't let up, his movements growing firmer, faster, until she cried out, her body convulsing around him as another wave of ecstasy washed over her. Her hands flew to his hair, tugging gently as she rode out the climax, her breathing ragged and uneven. When she finally came down, her grip on him loosened, but her eyes never left his. There was something indescribable in her gaze, a mix of awe, gratitude, and something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. Slowly, she reached up, cupping his face in her hands and pulling him down for a kiss that was softer, sweeter, but no less intense. "You're amazing," she breathed against his lips, her thumbs brushing over his cheeks. "Do you know that?" He flushed, his heart skipping a beat at her words. "Only because of you," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "You make me feel things I didn't even know I could feel." She smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a fresh wave of heat coursing through him. "Good," she said, her tone laced with mischief. "Because I'm not done with you yet." Before he could respond, she shifted beneath him, rolling them over until she was straddling his hips. Her robe had fallen open completely now, revealing every inch of her flawless body, and he couldn't tear his eyes away. She reached down, positioning herself over him, and he sucked in a sharp breath as she lowered herself slowly, inch by agonizing inch, until he was fully inside her. The sensation was overwhelming, unlike anything he'd ever experienced. She was warm, tight, and impossibly perfect, and he had to bite back a groan as she began to move, her hips rocking against his in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Her hands braced on his chest, her nails digging into his skin as she took control, guiding him deeper, harder, until every nerve in his body was alight with pleasure. "Look at me," she commanded, her voice low and sultry, and he obeyed instantly, his eyes locking onto hers. The intensity of her gaze held him captive, making it impossible to look away even as the sensations threatened to consume him. "This is us," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "No one else. Just us." He nodded, though words were beyond him at this point. All he could do was hold on to her, his hands gripping her hips as she moved, each stroke bringing him closer to the edge. Her breaths came in short, shallow gasps, her body tightening around him as she neared her own climax. And then, without warning, she leaned down, her lips brushing against his ear as she whispered, "Come with me, Ethan. Let go." Her words tipped him over the edge, his release crashing over him like a tidal wave as she tightened around him, her own climax hitting seconds later. They clung to each other, their bodies shaking with the force of their shared pleasure, until finally, they collapsed together in a tangled heap of limbs and sweat-soaked sheets. For several long moments, neither of them spoke, the only sound in the room are their heavy, labored breathing. But then, just as Ethan was beginning to drift in the afterglow, she turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "Promise me something," she said, her voice soft but serious. "Anything," he replied without hesitation. "Promise me this isn't just a one-time thing," she said, her fingers trailing lightly over his chest. "I need to know this is real." He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could get the words out, she kissed him, silencing him with a depth of emotion that left him breathless. When she finally pulled back, all he could do was nod, his heart swelling with something he couldn't quite name. And as they lay there, wrapped in each other's arms, he knew deep down that nothing would ever be the same again.